have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged.
If you're listening to this, you are the resistance. The resistance.
You're listening to the Oh Hell Yeah Show. Hosted by TJ Hale.
We are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America. It's a trap.
Hey, Truth Seekers, this is TJ. Thank you so much for joining me. My interview today is with Dr. E. Calvin Beisner, PhD. He's a spokesman for the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, and also an author and speaker on the application of the biblical worldview to economics, government, and environmental policy. Now, he's published over 10 books and hundreds of articles, and he's also a ruling elder in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church who's spoken to churches, seminars, radio and television programs and groups around the country for over 20 years. Now, today we're going to talk about some really important things, the first of which is poverty and how no country has gotten out of it without two crucial things. We're going to talk about how science has ascended only once in world history and who caused that to happen. We're also going to discuss the Lysankoist doctrine versus Gregor Mendel, which I think you're going to enjoy. Now, just a word of warning, this interview picks up in the first or second minute because I had a little glitch, and so you're going to catch Dr. Beisner midstream after I asked him about the cultural effects of this phenomenon for our population to worship the creation while ridicule or scorning the idea of a creator. So that's where we'll pick things up. And if you enjoy these interviews that I do weekly, please share them with fellow truth seekers. And you can catch us every single Wednesday on SoundCloud and YouTube. Off we go.
You don't go to a zoo and find that the animals are studying you. You go to the zoo and study the animals that are there. There's just something different about us. And that's because, as we read in the first chapter of the Bible, Genesis 1, when God had created all the various other kinds of life, he said to himself, let us make man in our own image and after our likeness. And God created man, male and female. He created them after his likeness, and he spoke to them and he blessed them. And he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and everything that moves on the face of the earth. So human beings really do have a very special place in creation, unlike any other living beings. And that doesn't mean that we're supposed to abuse and trample upon the others, but it does mean that we are to exercise this dominion that God calls for in Genesis 1:28. And we at the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation tend to define that this way: men and women made in God's image, working together lovingly to enhance the fruitfulness and the beauty and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and the benefit of our neighbors. So that really we're addressing the two great commandments there, to love God and to love neighbor. And I can't figure how anybody could reject the idea that we want to enhance the fruitfulness, beauty, and safety of the earth.
Yeah, one of the questions that always makes me curious is if you're a progressive, back since the 1920s when they were big fans of eugenics and they were trying to figure out how to get rid of the undesirables, which to a certain degree is still the case.
Yes.
If you support abortion, if you want to basically secure dependency, if the goal is to have less people on the earth, I like going to Yosemite, and my grandpa's been telling me since I was a kid when we go there, if it was up to the greenies, you'd only be able to see it by bus, and eventually you'd only be able to see pictures of it on Google. And they kind of feel that way about everywhere else in the world. They want to leave it untouched. And what I don't get is if you're trying to make sure there are fewer people and you're trying to kind of work to kill them off and get rid of them, why global warming is such a bad thing. Doesn't that help you accomplish your goal?
Well, what they actually find is that belief in dangerous man-made global warming, those two qualifiers, by the way, are very important in this discussion because folks on the other side of this will say, oh, if you deny this, you deny global warming itself. You deny climate change. Well, no, as a matter of fact, I affirm that climate changes and has always changed throughout Earth's history. We've had warming and cooling cyclically on various different lengths of time throughout geologic history. What I deny is that what we're experiencing now and what we can foresee over the next 100 years or so is A, dangerous, and B, primarily man-made. But at any rate, they find that belief in dangerous man-made global warming provides a rationale for their anti-human attitudes and their desire to reduce human population. Because what they can say is, look, it's people's use of fossil fuel energy, which, by the way, provides about 86% of all energy used in the world right now. It's people's use of fossil fuel energy that drives up carbon dioxide emissions, which drives up global temperature, which is going to cause catastrophe. Therefore, we need less use of fossil fuel energy. But since people look for energy to meet their needs, that means really we need fewer people. So, the top leaders of the world's largest environmental organizations tend to think that optimal world population would be around 500 million people, meaning we've got to get rid of about 95% of us. And they use the fear of dangerous man-made global warming as a rationale for doing that through population control programs, government-run family planning programs like China's one-child program, which lead, by the way, to sex selection abortions, resulting in a huge excess of males over females. For instance, in China, about 121 men for every 100 women, which means fewer men able to marry, which increases the demand for pornography and prostitution, which increases sexual trafficking, human trafficking. So ironically, Pope Francis recently has come out in support of global warming alarmism and doesn't realize that that is feeding the very policies that cause the human trafficking that he so abhors.
Are you saying that Mitt Romney didn't start the war on women? Is that what I'm getting out of this conversation?
No, I'm not. I mean, sorry. Yes, I am saying Mitt Romney did not start all of that.
Wow. Mind blown. All right. Well, there's a couple other major objectives you have at the Cornwall Alliance. Obviously, helping people understand the nature of creationism is one. What are the others? What are the pillars?
Yeah, well, we really have three fundamental emphases in our educational work. The first is to promote biblical earth stewardship. The second is to promote economic development for the very poor around the world. Think in terms of places like sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia and Latin America and Oceania, where extreme poverty results in short lives, a great deal of disease, and all sorts of suffering. And we see historically that no society has ever risen out of poverty without a combination of two things. One is a civil social order characterized by limited constitutional government, the rule of law, respect for private property rights, free trade, that sort of thing. And the other is access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy to replace human and animal muscle to produce and to transport all the various different things that we need to rise out of poverty. And then the third emphasis that we have is the proclamation and defense of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news that people like me, who don't always do what's right, even when we know that we ought to, that's the old-fashioned term for us is sinners, people like me can be reconciled to a holy and righteous God by the death of Jesus Christ, having taken my guilt upon himself. And as I repent of my sin, that is, I change my mind and decide it's not a good thing and I really ought to stop doing it, and I trust in him alone, God gives me the gift of Christ's righteousness and pronounces me righteous in his sight for his sake. And then he also gives me the Holy Spirit to live in me and to empower me to begin to be freed from that sinful proclivity. So those are the three things that we promote: biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the gospel of Christ.
All right, a lot to tackle here. I want to jump into the second one, which is poverty. You know, it's interesting to me that Jesus said, the poor will be with you always, right? So whenever I hear someone who's typically progressive, oftentimes someone like, let's just take Lyndon B. Johnson and this war on poverty. What would Jesus have said about the war on poverty and spending $10 trillion in economic surplus to get rid of something that he said would be with us forever? Break that down for us.
Well, first, let me just address the issue of Jesus having said that, the poor you have with you always. As a theologian and a biblical scholar, I have to keep reminding myself all the time that in all literary interpretation, context is king. And the historical context there, as well as the literary context of the Gospels where that's reported, is that you had Judas, who carried the common purse for Jesus and the disciples, upset because some woman was lavishly spending on him very valuable perfume ointment. And he said, shouldn't this have been sold so that it could be given to the poor? And of course, we're told by one of the gospel writers, well, that was really because he carries the purse and he was pilfering. And
right.
Jesus
and actually, I want to pause there because it's funny that, anytime someone is very anal or accusing you of it, it's interesting when you have an opportunity, like if you're holding the money and when you're paying your employees, or I don't know what the name for this phenomenon is. You're a doctor, maybe you do, but people who are sticklers about certain things often will tell you a lot about themselves when it comes time for them to pony up. I call it the Dateline Theory because you got these guys who are super protective of their wives end up being the ones that stab them 50 times and nobody was the wiser.
Yeah, well, what's really interesting here is that Judas is the perfect picture of the liberal welfare state. He's not really nearly so concerned about the poor as he is about how much of the redistributed wealth winds up in his own pocket as he administers the whole thing. But Jesus wasn't saying there that we will never get rid of poverty. What he was saying was, hey, Judas and the rest of you disciples, you can minister to the poor anytime. Right now, I'm about to go die, and this woman is anointing my body in preparation for that. Don't stop her. Now, what do we do, though, about poverty? Well, the war on poverty, Johnson's program, was really a war on the poor. And the reason I say that is, first, historically, we can see from the data that it has not reduced the rate of poverty in the United States. If anything, it has solidified and somewhat raised it. It certainly slowed and stopped the rate at which poverty was declining in America. It was declining much faster before the war on poverty. But then second, what we can say about that is that the war on poverty was all about forcibly taking wealth from some people to whom it belonged and giving it to other people. Now, I'm all in favor of being liberal, that is, generous. And I give generously to help people around the world, and I encourage other people to do that. But the eighth commandment, you shall not steal, does not say you shall not steal unless you are the government.
It's funny when I interpret it, I agree. I mean, the context is hugely important. And I've always wondered, when Jesus spoke, if the natural state of man is poverty. I mean, you said it earlier when you made your case that it takes two things for people to get out of poverty, and we rarely see those things in place, which is why America is so unique and is the city on the hill. So was Jesus speaking about the fact that the natural state of man, probably until America arrives and even long after it's gone, if that happens, will be for people to be poor all over the world, and so it's always our duty to help them? Was it it's a spiritual poverty as well, where we have to constantly be fighting against the effects of spiritual death and the natural man? I've thought about that a lot as well, and I like that you brought some clarity to it. My question is, though, if when it comes to, with regards to, I just lost my train of thought, which happens to me all the time.
It happens to brilliant people, I mean, you've got so many thoughts going through at once, it's hard to keep them all under control.
It's a good thing half the world's diagnosed with ADD, so we have an excuse now for just not being able to focus on making concise thoughts. Let me go to maybe we'll come back to that. Let me go to something we talked about in the pregame, which was you actually said the H word. You brought Hitler into discussion, which instantly is going to end it. But it came up because we talked about how young kids today, I mean, why should they care about things like the Cornwall Alliance and the things Dr. Beisner has to say? I mean, they've got TMZ, they've got smartphones with Snapchat. I mean, they just don't have time for these kinds of ideas and for reading books. And I actually had Larry Schweikert on my show, who wrote the Patriots Patriots History of the United States, and he told me he's never going to write another book. Something similar to what Dinesh D'Souza said, where he goes, I can write a book and 100,000 people will read it, or 500,000 if I'm lucky, or I can make a movie and 8 million people will see it, and young people will see it and they'll get exposed to ideas they've never had before. And so the point of this is that you've got all these kids who would say, the big thing to the meme is, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. And you described what I would refer to as a rationalization of spirituality, that they're all not equal. Let's go back into that discussion because I thought it was great.
Yeah, let's do that. Essentially, what we were talking about pregame, as you say, was how many people will say, look, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Well, spirituality is a good thing. We are spiritual beings. Every one of us has a soul or a spirit. And that is one of the ways in which we reflect God, who is spirit. Jesus told us God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit. And he added, and in truth. And there are true spiritualities and false spiritualities. And I simply pointed out that Adolf Hitler and the whole Nazi philosophy was rooted in a spirituality that, interestingly enough, is heavily embodied in a particular approach to ecology and ecologism. This is described in great detail in a wonderful book by a good friend of mine, Mark Musser, called Nazi Oaks, who really reveals the ecological roots of Hitler's Nazi philosophy, his eugenicism, his racism, and so on. I've discussed the same thing in a DVD lecture that I have done. By the way, you talked about not writing books, but doing movies and so on. Well, we have a DVD called Godly Dominion versus Environmentalism. And in there, I discuss the whole historical roots of much of the Green movement, moving from Thomas Robert Malthus in the late 18th century and his essay on population, who started the idea that population grows exponentially, whereas resources, especially food, grows only arithmetically. So therefore, you're going to wind up with famines controlling population. He forgot there, of course, that people produce food. So if people are multiplying exponentially, their production of food is going to do that too. But that gave rise to Charles Darwin and his notion of the competition for survival and the survival of the fittest, which gave rise to his cousin Francis Galton's ideas of eugenics, leading to the efforts, especially by the British, and I hate to tell you, but it's true, the Americans, to impose eugenicist thought on the rest of the world through population control efforts, focused especially on brown, black, and yellow people, the wrong colors, not fit and wonderful like, well, I'm not sure what ethnic background you are, but hey, I'm a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That makes me fitter, supposedly.
I'm 1/13. I'm 1/13 Native American.
Racism, and it is not good spirituality. And so we need to approach our spirituality with a quest for truth. And for that, we need transcendent, objective standards rather than everything being subjective.
Like Elizabeth Warren, I'm between 1/16th and 1/32nd Native American. I'm actually applying for a job at Harvard right now. Haven't heard back, but I'm optimistic.
I actually have a little bit of Cherokee in my background as well.
Rake it in, man. That's the gold mine. In fact, I'm working on a clock right now too. I'm just trying desperately to get on the news media somehow. So I've got a lot of ideas on how to do it. But so white privilege started a long time ago, and it was imposed on yellows and blacks and browns. Like you said, the thing that's so frustrating to me about this is when I get into friendly discussions with my less enlightened friends, I hear about science a lot. And sometimes it comes with exclamation points. Other times it's in all caps, science, science, science. And you just illustrated something that's important, is that these men were limited by the information they had at the time and the fact that they don't have a perspective that goes beyond their own intellect. So the people who predicted that we'd run out of food and that we'd run out of space on the planet, we're kind of just going based off what they knew a couple hundred years ago. And we see that today, where science is only as good as the information they have and the incentives they have to produce it. I mean, I go crazy when I have people tell me that college scientists, and no offense to you, because technically you're a doctor and you work for universities, but that they would never fudge numbers regarding climate change or other issues that are completely, basically nonsense.
Receiving your PhD is no more a path to instantaneous sanctification than passing the civil service exam or being elected to Congress or the White House. We all have this proclivity to sin in us, which is why we need a savior in Jesus Christ. But yeah, science is very important, and it's a wonderful thing. It's a great tool for understanding the world. What a lot of people don't understand is that science and Christianity are natural allies. In fact, historically, science only arose, that is, science as a systematic procedure of hypothesis and experimentation and testing and observation and revising of hypothesis and so on. The scientific method, as distinct from occasional bright flashes of insight, which have occurred in other places. But science, as this method, arose only once in history and in only one place, and that was medieval Europe, a culture just totally imbued with the biblical worldview that a rational God created an ordered universe to be understood by rational human beings made in his image. And it's that science that gave birth to the technologies that lifted us out of abject poverty, delivered us from the situation where, for all people everywhere, average life expectancy at birth was about 27 or 28 years, to where now, worldwide, it's approaching 70 years, and in developed countries like ours, it's around 80 years.
Do you ever wonder how they did that without Obamacare? It boggles my mind. 60-year life expectancy edition with no universal health care. I'm scratching my head. I don't get it.
Yeah, well, they did it because when people are left free to pursue their own interests within the limits of the moral law of God expressed in the rule of law, then they produce more and they share it more than when people are organized by central committees. And the reason for this is that the freedom that people express through their market transactions does a better job than any other process of communicating where things are most valued and how things are most valued, and therefore what gets produced, by whom, for whom, at what costs. Other alternatives, socialism, mercantilism, a mixed economy, anything where you try to put some particular committees in charge of those decisions, lacks the fundamental information necessary to maximize the efficiency of the use of resources and therefore the benefit of that use to people.
I think this is a fundamental fallacy of people like you underestimating the level at which these people think about themselves, the way they esteem their own intelligence, which, it's a rookie mistake, but fortunately we have history to show us how well that usually works out when it's a total command control economy. There's a couple of things that... Oh, go ahead.
This is why we're seeing this massive immigration from the United States and Western Europe to places like Cuba and Russia and China and North Korea. People really want to go to the workers' paradise and get out of the just disastrous places where freedom has ruled.
Yeah. I've been trying to get my visa approved to go to Cuba for years, and they don't want me. Society's too good without me, apparently. And that's the thing. When I remember reading the reviews for Sicko, that Michael Moore movie about how great healthcare is in Cuba and how everyone loves it there, I thought to myself, where's the boat? How do I get on? How do I get out of here? And apparently it just didn't exist. But nobody really talked about that in my circle of influence. They just said that people live longer there and they get better healthcare. And I'm excited about that coming to America. I can't wait. You mentioned earlier when I asked you what really has been getting your attention in the news, again in our pregame, you mentioned this coalition of scientists who want to punish people who don't think the way they do. They already do this in some places. I know Russia's one, Hollywood is another, where you can actually be financially and physically punished for not participating in groupthink. What will happen if that is commonplace or officially commonplace in the scientific community? I know it's already kind of the theme in some places.
Right. Well, what will happen is going to be analogous to what happened in the Soviet Union under Lysenkoism. This was the notion put forward by the botanist Trofim Lysenko that species go through changes not because of inherited genetic information, but rather because their environments cause changes to their outward structures that then get inherited. That Lysenkoist doctrine was officially embraced by Stalin and made a part of Soviet dogma. And consequently, they used a system of terror, really, in their struggle against other biologists for bureaucratic and academic positions. And the anti-Lysenkoists, the followers of Gregor Mendel, whose genetic theory turned out to be true when we discovered what the actual genes are, what DNA is, and so on. The anti-Lysenkoists faced the threat of public denunciation, by the way, which is happening to critics of global warming alarmism now, loss of Communist Party membership, loss of employment position, and arrest by the secret police. Some of them, in fact, were imprisoned and were subjected to horrific torture and sometimes even to killing. And the Soviet Union also had, not just in biology, but a similar political strong-arm tactic was used in their nuclear physics program, which set their nuclear research back by decades as their biology had been. Well, when you try to politicize science, you slow down the discovery of facts. And all of that, of course, is entirely aside from the fact that these folks who want scientists who question dangerous man-made global warming investigated and possibly prosecuted under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You wonder, have they ever heard of the First Amendment? That stuff about freedom of speech and freedom of the press?
That came up recently. Did you hear the clip of Hillary Clinton being chatted up by some Black Lives Matter activists behind closed doors? Did you hear what she said to them? She said, and they were asking why she wasn't doing more, and she gave kind of her glib, her bromides in response to that. And they said, look, they called her out and said, that's not really good enough. Like, this is your fault. You're the reason Bill Clinton gave us these, more stringent laws that target black people, et cetera, their whole mantra. And she said, look, I don't believe, and they go, why don't you do more? You can do more and you're not doing it. You're making excuses. She says, I don't believe that you persuade people. I believe you create laws to change their behavior. And I went, ding, 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 ding. Yeah. Like, that should be all over the place. There it is in a nutshell. You've just described exactly what these Russians did with their botanist, whose name I can't say, but I'm going to look it up later. And every single command control economy, they don't believe in persuading with ideas. Hence, I deduct that they don't really like the First Amendment that much because it's more fun to ignore that one and enforce the ones they add afterwards.
Yeah, by the way, to learn about Lysenko, you might start by going to the blog post that I wrote about that just this morning on cornwallalliance.org. Just go there and then click on blog, and you'll come quickly to that one. But I'm always trying as a theologian philosopher to trace things down to fundamental principles, to their roots in worldview, and this proclivity to try to use force instead of persuasion is really quite consistent with the naturalistic worldview, the worldview that says that matter and energy and motion is all that exists. Because that worldview fundamentally cannot justify belief in reason itself. When a cue ball and another billiard ball meet on the table, they don't have a discussion as to which one's going to go where next, right? It's a sheer matter of force. Well, if the human mind is nothing but matter and energy and motion, atoms colliding with each other, then there's no reasoning going on there either. So if you have a worldview that is atheistic, naturalistic, you have fundamentally a worldview that rejects the possibility of reason. And then, if you can't get somebody to agree with you by trying to reason with him, which of course you shouldn't be trying to do anyway, you have no problem with the notion of forcing him to do so. And so that's what we see when, for instance, when Darwinist naturalists insist that people have to embrace Darwinism and we're not going to allow contrary ideas to be talked about in the public schools, or that you have to believe in dangerous man-made global warming and we're not going to allow anything else to be taught in the public schools. Both of those, by the way, are the position of the next generation science standards being foisted on our public schools all over the country right now. That's perfectly consistent with their worldview. It's the Christian worldview that acknowledges that we're made in God's image with minds that are capable of rational thought and capable of free choice it's that worldview that really supports the use of reason and dialogue and discussion instead of force.
I wish I were Penn Jillette or Sam Harris or a more of a passive atheist who could defend their position. But what I see as you're saying this is that one of those people would say, well, that's not necessarily true because, if you read Reason Magazine or if you proclaim to be atheistic, that's actually the base of all reason, not to have this corrupting influence of mysticism and a God that you can't see, touch, or feel ostensibly, leading you astray from actual reason. But here's my problem with that, if that's what was said. When you're defending those people, they always make when you're discussing it with those people, they'll make a distinction between their style of atheism and a militant atheism, which does exactly those things that you describe, and they'll agree with that. The same thing you have when when a kid who's Muslim gets conned into creating a media circus around a clock that looks like a bomb, and they say, hey, just to be clear, in case you haven't heard this ad nauseum, not all Muslims want to kill everyone. And this is one of these people. This is one of the good Muslims. And I think to myself, is that why they do the same thing to us? They say, look, are you one of those Christians who's blowing up abortion clinics, or are you one of the reasonable ones? Because like the analogy you gave earlier of Judas, they fall into the camp where that actually is happening regularly.
Yeah, one of the things that makes us better and better thinkers over time is when we look carefully for the inconsistencies in our thought, for the places where what we think about X is really contrary to what we think about Y, and then we look for a way to reconcile the two. And often it requires that we do some revising on part of what we think. And so, with the atheist who says, oh, really, my atheism makes me more rational, I want to point out to him that his atheism really provides no fundamental ground for belief in rationality at all. Now, he's welcome to be inconsistent if he wants to be, and I'm glad that he's inconsistent because he actually tries to reason, though his worldview doesn't support that. But it really is inconsistent. I think he would be better off to switch to a worldview that has a basis for rationality.
Interesting. I'd be curious to have that discussion with one because they, rationality is their ostensible baseline. It's their foundation. Yes. It's rational because I'm not influenced by things that are irrational to me, which obviously the whole doctrine, Christian doctrine, is that you can't, it's incumbent on you to search out God, to knock, to ask, to seek if you want to find him. So they can't experience the blessings of that or the fruit of those actions, which is why it's irrational to them when it's crystal clear to people like us, which I think is a shame. Before we go, when you were talking about the top-down command control, the government compulsion behind ideas are not really great. I was actually thinking about the inception of the Roman Catholic Church, and when there were times in history where there were multiple popes and they were killing each other and they were doing horrible things to their subjects, and all these other historical facts that get forgotten when the Pope comes to Washington, D.C., and every single channel shows the Pope for 6 days straight, which is my favorite time of year, by the way. So I'm actually glad he doesn't come that often because I imagine the traffic in D.C. was terrible.
It was. I was there.
When he's on TV and I've got people going, oh my gosh, it's the Pope, I'm going crazy. And I'm watching these people cry and they're fighting crowds. And I mean, it's basically they're up there with my Disneyland fanatic friends. I mean, they're just doing completely irrational things. And I think to myself, you know what I don't hear a lot about? And there was an article recently about how the Pope didn't mention Christ. The Vicar of Christ didn't mention the C word one time during his speech. It's very light doctrinally. There's very little of, he's like Peter, but there's not really much of what Peter did in the Bible. And I think, aren't these people really just dying to be fed, to sponge up the doctrine of Christ, to be given something that brings them closer to God? And what they get is I don't want to be mean to Catholics or people who believe in them, but there's just nothing there. For me, it's hollow. It's empty. It's very...
Yeah, I think the Pope missed a great opportunity to speak for Jesus Christ himself. I think that's not terribly surprising, granted that what he was speaking for in terms of, on the one hand, the replacement of a free market society and free trade as the global economic order with socialism, which is very command and control oriented and contrary to liberty. And what he was speaking for in terms of saying we have to fight global warming with with policies that are going to impoverish the poor around the world, and his call for forced redistribution of wealth around the world. None of those things is consistent with Christ's own teaching that affirms all of the law of God, including the eighth commandment, you shall not steal. And so it's not terribly surprising that he missed the opportunity to speak up for Jesus Christ himself. But this is the real solution. I mean, if we look at history, the places that have enjoyed the most freedom, as well as the most prosperity, and within that freedom, the most virtuous use of that freedom are the places that have been the most heavily influenced by the gospel of Jesus Christ, by people coming to know God, to be reconciled to him by faith in Christ, and to know themselves to be sinners who need to have their lives transformed by the power of God's Holy Spirit, which comes only through faith in Jesus Christ. So historically, that's been the case, and this is why the Cornwall Alliance seeks really to tie in the gospel with our work about both environmental stewardship and economic development for the poor. We're doing that and discussing the importance of the Christian faith to the development of science, for instance, in a series of videos that we're posting on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel, Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, and we're going to be putting up a series of 35 videos discussing the climate problem, the energy problem, policy related to that, but this also includes some fascinating discussions of the origin of science and the importance of Christianity to it. And then we also have a petition that is on our website. The petition is Forget Climate Change, Energy Empowers the Poor. And this is a way for people to tell their political leaders, we want to see the poor rise out of poverty rather than be trapped in it by policies that cut off their access to the abundant, affordable, reliable energy that is absolutely necessary for them to overcome poverty.
Wind power. Yeah, I'm on board completely.
Right, which is not exactly the source of that abundant, affordable, reliable power. You can't get it in the massive scales and with the instant on-demand availability, 24/7, 365. Wind just won't cut it there.
When you made the argument about the most prosperous societies that have existed, I feel like, I don't know if it's in college or if it's within these circles of, deep thought, like when goth people get together, but I find that when I make arguments, there's always a knee-jerk, low-info voter reaction, and I call it the Jedi mind trick, right? Someone went to these weak-minded people and said, yeah, well, when someone says you live in a prosperous society, why is that? You say, well, because they stole it from the Native Americans.
Yeah, as if the Native Americans had all that to steal.
Right. And so there's one that I actually want you to address before we go, because it came up while you were speaking, again, because I'm ADD. And that is, the other day I got in a huge discussion on Twitter. I actually pulled in a couple other people, and it was a lot of fun, about this notion that people really believe that the Nazis were hardcore right-wingers. Despite the evidence, despite the things they believed, despite the ideas associated with their movement, they were right-wingers. And I think part of it is, because you said earlier, they were into mysticism, they were into ecology, they hated Jews, they wanted to take over the world, they wanted to force people to be compelled by government. Oh, well, the answer to that is they were right-wingers, right? That's it.
That is right-wing, of course.
Yeah, that's what right-wingers want to do. That's the Jedi mind trick. So give me a couple minutes of addressing that one, because I laid waste to this guy, but I hear it pretty often, and it's sad to me. It brings me to tears.
Well, it's not for nothing that they were called the Nationalische Sozialistische Party. It's National Socialism. That's not right wing. That's left wing.
Okay, Jedi mind trick. Here's the answer to that. Yeah, but that's not what socialism actually is. So that's not socialism. It's different.
Right. I mean, their notion was that you could leave the ownership of corporations in private hands, but the determination of what those corporations would produce, using what resources, by whom and for whom, at what prices, all of that would be decided by the state, which essentially is saying, look, we're going to leave the title for your company in your hands, but we get to determine what it does. That's what real ownership is. There is no such thing as ownership without control. So That's the National Socialist type of socialism, whereas the Russian communist type of socialism says, we're not only going to control all of what you have, we're going to take the title to it too. Now, the title, of course, didn't make any difference, but that's the only real difference between National Socialism and Russian socialism.
Jedi mind tricks. You should do a video on those. There's an answer for every. There's a simplistic, nonsensical, non sequitur answer for every idea that makes sense out there, and I enjoy colliding with them head on. Well, Dr. Beisner, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Is your YouTube channel live already, or is that pending?
It is. It is. We've got the first 8 of the 35 videos in the series already up now, and we're putting a new one up every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday until early December. We also have a new documentary video coming out called Greener. Called The Grass. The grass is greener on the other side. At the moment, I'm forgetting the title of this documentary. Anyway, it'll be...
It's catchy, though. We know that, obviously.
Right. This is coming out. We're launching it October 20 with a premiere at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. It'll be out on DVD. We've done interviews with 31 different outstanding scientists, economists, policy experts, theologians, and so on all of these related topics. And they go into the YouTube videos. They'll also go into this documentary that we're bringing out. So people can learn more about that at cornwallalliance.org, where they can also sign up for our free electronic newsletter. Every issue of it is meant to be educational.
Outstanding. Well, I'll link to that in the show notes. I'll get that information from you. Now, Barack Obama and Al Gore have Nobel Prizes. Do any of these scientists have them? Because otherwise, I don't know if I'll plan on showing up or not. I mean, that's kind of my minimum standard of performance for deciding if I'm going to partake.
Well, of course, Barack Obama's Nobel Prize is the Peace Prize, not in science. Al Gore's Nobel Prize, half of it is half of a Peace Prize. The other half went to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Keep in mind, by the way, the Peace Prizes are not elected by the same body that does the prizes in, say, physics and medicine and chemistry and so on. They are highly political, whereas these others are done by real scholars.
I know they asked for Obama's prize back. Do they ever do that with the real prizes that they give out for mathematical or scientific accomplishment?
I don't happen to know.
Well,
on that one.
It's been a real pleasure to have you on. I wish you a lot of success with the new venture on YouTube. I think that's a phenomenal way to go, especially to reach out to the subjects of the Jedi mind tricks. And I appreciate you making the time to come on. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you very much, TJ. Look forward to another time.
You're listening to the absolute unadulterated truth, courtesy of the Oh Hail Yeah Show. Want more? Oh. Hail yeah, you do.
I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the Young Cons podcast on iTunes or SoundCloud. And make sure to check us out online at youngcons.com/podcast. Or chat us up on Twitter at RealTJHale.